On July 24, 1943, at the secret headquarters of RAF Bomber Command in High Wycombe, a series of orders were finalized that would change the nature of aerial warfare forever. For years, the Allies had struggled to penetrate the sophisticated Kammhuber Line, a dense network of German radar and night fighters that had claimed thousands of British airmen. But as night fell over the English Channel, 791 bombers began their ascent, carrying a weapon that weighed next to nothing but possessed the power to blind the entire Third Reich. Inside the lead Lancasters, crewmen began kicking out bundles of window, millions of small, aluminum-coated paper strips designed to saturate German radar screens with thousands of false echoes. Over the North Sea, German radar operators watched in mounting horror as their screens suddenly dissolved into a chaotic blizzard of white noise. The invisible shield of the Reich had vanished, and the city of Hamburg lay defenseless beneath the summer moon. The target was not merely the U-boat pens or the industrial shipyards of Blohm and Voss, but the very heart of Germany's second-largest city. As the first wave of incendiaries began to fall, the scale of the destruction was unlike anything the world had seen. Within hours, the RAF dropped 2,300 tons of explosives, an amount equal to the 5 most destructive German raids on London combined. Below, the orderly harbor city was transformed into a landscape of fire and collapsing masonry. For the Nazi leadership in Berlin, the initial reports were confusing, but the panic was immediate. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe who had once famously boasted that no enemy bomber would ever reach the Ruhr, was faced with the undeniable reality that his air defenses were obsolete. While the physical damage was immense, the psychological shock to the high command was even more profound. They realized that if the Allies could do this to Hamburg, no city in Germany was safe. This was the beginning of Operation Gomorrah, a campaign designed to rain down the wrath of God and break the back of the German war machine. The weather on the night of July 27, 1943, provided the final, lethal ingredient for a catastrophe that even the RAF's planners had not fully anticipated. While the first raid on July 24 had crippled the city's defenses, the second major strike targeted the densely packed residential districts of Hammerbrook, Rothenburgsort, and Borgfeld. These areas were characterized by narrow streets and multi-story timber-framed apartment blocks, which acted as a massive reservoir of fuel. At 11:40 p.m., the first markers fell, and within minutes, more than 700 aircraft began unloading a concentrated mix of high-explosive cookies and thousands of small incendiary sticks. The high explosives blew out windows and roofs, exposing the interiors of the buildings, while the incendiaries ignited the contents. What followed was a meteorological phenomenon known as a firestorm. Because the summer had been unusually hot and dry, the low humidity meant the buildings ignited with terrifying speed. As thousands of individual fires merged into one giant conflagration, the superheated air began to rise rapidly, creating a vacuum at the base of the fire. This vacuum drew in oxygen from the surrounding areas with the force of a hurricane. Air at ground level reached speeds of 150 miles per hour, pulling people, trees, and even heavy furniture into the center of the furnace. The temperatures in the heart of the firestorm soared to 800 degrees Celsius, a heat so intense it melted glass and caused the asphalt in the streets to liquefy and burst into flames. For the people trapped below, there was no escape. The firestorm acted like a giant chimney, sucking the oxygen out of the air raid shelters. Thousands who had sought safety in basements were either incinerated or died of carbon monoxide poisoning as the fires above consumed every breathable molecule. It was a level of concentrated destruction that defied conventional military experience. When news of the firestorm reached the Nazi leadership the following morning, the atmosphere in Berlin shifted from concern to pure existential dread. They were no longer just fighting a war of attrition. They were witnessing the systematic erasure of their industrial and social fabric from the sky. This realization would force the highest-ranking officials of the Third Reich to confront a reality they had long tried to ignore. The reports reaching Berlin on the morning of July 28 were not merely accounts of a military defeat. They were descriptions of an apocalypse that threatened the very stability of the National Socialist state. Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments and the man responsible for keeping the German war machine functioning, was among the first to grasp the strategic implications. Speer later recounted that Hamburg was the greatest catastrophe the Reich had faced to date, a nightmare that left him in a state of shock. He understood that Hamburg was one of the industrial pillars of the Reich, home to vital petroleum refineries and the massive shipyards that produced the U-boats intended to starve Britain into submission. If the Royal Air Force could repeat this level of devastation in 6 or 8 other major German cities, Speer privately concluded that the war would be over within months. The industrial output of the nation would simply cease to exist under a canopy of fire. He rushed to meet with Adolf Hitler, but found a leader increasingly detached from the physical reality of the ruins. Hitler refused to visit the bombed cities, fearing the psychological toll of seeing the charred remains of his people and the total failure of his promised air defense. Instead, he channeled his fury toward the Luftwaffe leadership, accusing Hermann Göring and his commanders of cowardice and incompetence. While Speer analyzed the industrial collapse, Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, faced a crisis of morale that no amount of rhetoric could easily fix. Goebbels wrote in his private diaries that the news from Hamburg was terrifying, and that the psychological impact on the German populace was a fateful blow. The thousands of refugees fleeing the burning city acted as carriers of panic, spreading eyewitness accounts of the firestorm to every corner of the Reich. They spoke of the Phosphorus War, of children melting in the streets, and of a sky that had turned black with soot for days. Goebbels realized that the myth of German invincibility had been permanently shattered. The air war had brought the front line into the bedrooms of German civilians, and for the first time, the Nazi leadership felt the ground shifting beneath them. They were forced to divert massive resources, thousands of anti-aircraft guns and hundreds of fighter planes, from the Eastern Front to the defense of the Reich. This was the second front that the Allies had opened long before a single soldier stepped onto the beaches of Normandy. The panic was not just about the loss of buildings, but the realization that the initiative had passed irrevocably to the Allied bombers. The total paralysis of the Luftwaffe's night fighter force during the Hamburg raids was a humiliation that demanded an immediate, if desperate, tactical revolution. For years, the German defense had relied on the Himmelbett system, where ground controllers guided individual night fighters into a specific box of airspace to intercept bombers detected by radar. However, the introduction of window had rendered the Würzburg and Freya radar sets useless, leaving the Messerschmitt Bf 110 and Junkers Ju 88 crews flying blind in a sea of aluminum interference. The realization that the RAF could now mask its approach at will created a vacuum in command that was filled by Major Hajo Hermann, a bomber pilot who proposed a radical and controversial solution known as Wilde Sau, or wild boar tactics. Hermann's concept was born of necessity and the recognition that if radar was blinded, the Luftwaffe had to rely on the most primitive of tools, the human eye. Under the wild boar system, single-engine day fighters, primarily the Focke-Wulf FW-190 and Messerschmitt Bf 109, were sent into the night sky without the aid of ground-directed radar. Instead, they were instructed to fly above the bomber stream and use the intense light provided by the burning cities below to silhouette the British Lancasters and Halifaxes against the clouds. This was a chaotic and dangerous form of freelance hunting. Pilots navigated by the glow of the fires, searching for the dark shapes of the Allied aircraft amidst the flak and searchlights. While the German High Command was initially skeptical of sending light, short-range fighters into the darkness, the sheer scale of the Hamburg disaster left them with no alternative. The implementation of wild boar tactics reflected the sheer desperation of the air defense situation. It was a strategy that accepted high operational losses. Landing a high-speed fighter on a darkened, often bombed-out runway required immense skill and luck. Furthermore, it created a dangerous environment for the German flak crews, who now had to distinguish between the heavy four-engine British bombers and their own small, agile fighters circling in the same airspace. Despite these risks, the Luftwaffe saw no other way to penetrate the radar jamming screen. The air war had devolved into a primal struggle where the technological advantage of the RAF was met with a brutal, visual-only counteroffensive. This shift underscored a fundamental change in the air war over Germany. The scientific precision of the Kammhuber Line had been replaced by a frantic, manual struggle for survival. The destruction of Hamburg did more than shatter buildings and morale. It severed the vital arteries of the German war economy, specifically the production and distribution of oil. By 1943, The Third Reich was increasingly dependent on synthetic oil plants and the refineries located in major industrial hubs like Hamburg. The Firestorm had successfully targeted the Eurotank and Abano refineries, causing a massive spike in the loss of fuel reserves that the Wehrmacht could ill afford. Albert Speer, witnessing the smoldering ruins of the storage tanks, realized that the Allied air forces had found a vulnerability that could ground the Luftwaffe and stall the Panzerwaffe simultaneously. This forced a radical and costly reorganization of German resources. Thousands of laborers, many of them forced laborers and concentration camp prisoners, were diverted from other essential war projects to begin the Herculean task of dispersal, moving critical oil and armaments production into underground facilities or hidden forest sites. This shift toward the defense of the Reich had a catastrophic ripple effect on the other fronts of the war. To protect the skies over the fatherland from another Hamburg-scale disaster, the German High Command was forced to withdraw 3/4 of its heavy anti-aircraft batteries from the Eastern Front. These 88mm guns, which were the most effective anti-tank weapons against Soviet T-34s, were now pointed at the sky over Berlin, the Ruhr, and the remaining refineries. Furthermore, the focus of aircraft production shifted almost entirely to interceptors at the expense of bombers and transport planes. By prioritizing the defense of the German interior, the Nazi leadership essentially conceded the strategic initiative on the ground in Russia and the Mediterranean. The iron ring of defenses around German cities became a vacuum that sucked in the best pilots, the most advanced radar technology, and millions of rounds of ammunition every month. The psychological toll on the leadership was equally severe. The Hamburg shock led to a permanent change in the relationship between Hitler and his senior commanders. The Führer's refusal to visit the city created a vacuum of leadership that was filled by a mixture of local Gauleiters and technical experts like Speer, leading to a fragmented and often contradictory defensive strategy. The German leadership was now reacting to Allied moves rather than dictating the course of the conflict. They were caught in a trap where every effort to strengthen the air defense of one city left another exposed, and every gallon of fuel spent by an interceptor was a gallon lost to the tanks on the Eastern Front. The firestorm of Hamburg had not only burned a city, it had ignited a logistical crisis that would eventually lead to the mechanical strangulation of the Third Reich. The legacy of Operation Gomorrah remains one of the most sobering chapters in the history of the Second World War, representing a shift in aerial doctrine from tactical support to the dehousing and industrial annihilation of the enemy. The firestorm of July 1943 had effectively turned Hamburg into a tomb, with official German records eventually acknowledging the deaths of approximately 42,000 civilians. For the British Air Ministry and Arthur Bomber Harris, the results were a grim confirmation that their theories of area bombing could produce results equivalent to a major ground offensive. However, the victory came with an expiration date. The window technology that had blinded German radar was quickly analyzed by Luftwaffe technicians, who eventually developed new frequencies and ground tracking methods that restored their ability to intercept the bomber streams. The brief window of absolute Allied dominance in the night sky began to close, leading to the even more costly air battles of late 1943 and early 1944. Yet, the strategic damage to the Nazi hierarchy was permanent. The Hamburg shock had forced the German leadership to accept that their borders were no longer at the Channel or the Volga, but in the skies above their own homes. The panic that gripped leaders like Speer and Goebbels was justified. By the war's end, the diversion of resources to defend against these raids was so massive that it accounted for a significant portion of the Reich's total war expenditure. The scorched earth of Hamburg served as a prototype for the destruction of Dresden, Berlin, and dozens of other cities, creating a precedent for total war that would eventually culminate in the atomic age. Today, the ruins of the St. Nikolai Church in Hamburg stand as a hollowed-out memorial to the thousands who perished in the heat of the firestorm, a permanent reminder of the night the sky fell. As we look back at these events, we see more than just a military operation. We see the moment the German High Command realized that the war they had started was finally, and catastrophically, coming home. If you found this deep dive into the turning points of the air war insightful, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more detailed historical documentaries. We appreciate your support in keeping these stories of the past alive.